Antoinette and Vincent Dungan Lectureship on Energy and the Environment. A wonderful program that started 2 years ago when Andy Lipkis made a presentation, and last year when Jeanette Siddiq-Khan also presented. And now this year, we're fortunate to have Peter Gleick, who is a really marvelous person who connects with a number of different important critical issues of the day. I came across Peter's work about 25 years ago when I was on the board of directors of the Metropolitan Water District, and discovered that there were some really interesting things coming out of Northern California about the connections between water and climate change, energy issues, a wide range of ways to think about environment and particularly how the water industry itself functioned in places like California. At that time, Peter had come out of Berkeley. He had been at the Energy Resources Group, and he started an organization called the Pacific Institute. Started just with a handful of people. It's now, I guess, 24 years old. As it developed over time, it increased both its research capacity, it worked on policy issues, it produced really important publications on issues like water and climate change, on issues like global trade and goods movement, freight transport, issues of environmental justice. And Peter himself has been just an enormous influence, really a force of nature in terms of making that connection between research and action, between policy and social change, looking at it at the global scale in terms of water issues, and looking at it in relation to places like California, Northern California and Southern California. He's written 7 books. He's done many, many reports. He has his institute's coming out with another book next year. Most recently, he produced this book, which is out in the back. You never introduce someone who's written a book without telling that is available for you to pick up as part of any presentation like this. He's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And in 2003, he became a MacArthur Fellow. But what strikes me so significantly in terms of Peter's work is that link between research and action. That when you're thinking whether it's global water crises or bottled water, that research becomes part of a process of making change happen. So aside from his many other accomplishments, I think of Peter Gleick as a change maker. So welcome, Peter Gleick.
Well, thank you, Bob, very much for that. Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank President Veach and Bob for inviting me down, and the Edgertons for hosting this, I guess it's an annual lecture. I'm very honored to be invited to present this year. What I'm going to try and do tonight is talk about the global water problem. I'm going to talk about bottled water as a symptom of some of the challenges that we face, and then I'm going to come back to some positive solutions, because I think there's a lot of good news out there, and it's too easy to talk about the bad news all the time. So I'll try and offer some thoughts about moving toward what I think of as a more sustainable future for water. And I think we'll
That's good.
While I hate to turn the light down on me, I'm going to show some slides, and so I think we'll leave it this way.
Yep.
I hope everybody can see. So let me start by talking about the global water crisis, and what I mean by the global water crisis. There are a lot of components to this. There are a lot of ways to think about this. There are a lot of ways to describe it, but let me talk about a group of them. The most important piece of this, in my mind, is that the failure as a global society to meet basic human needs for water, to provide safe water and sanitation for everyone. There are 1 billion people worldwide that don't have access to safe drinking water. There are 2.5 billion people worldwide, 40% or so of the world's population that do not have access to adequate sanitation services, something all of us take for granted. And that's, by itself, enough, in my mind, to be called a global water crisis. The failure to meet basic human needs for water leads to bad things. It leads to water-related diseases, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, guinea worm, schistosomiasis, the things that you get when you don't have access to safe water or adequate sanitation. Things that we got rid of years ago in the United States when we put in place our excellent water system. There's local water scarcity and depletion. There are just parts of the world that don't have a lot of water. Nature distributes water around the planet, but it distributes water unevenly. We get water in different places at different times. There are dry places, there are wet places, there are dry seasons, there are wet seasons, so there is local scarcity. And often when you hear about a water crisis, it's because somebody is arguing we don't have enough water. And that's certainly true. It's certainly true in the Middle East. It's certainly true in the Persian Gulf. And that relates to water politics, which I'll come back to a little bit later. But we don't just have a water quantity problem, we have a water quality problem. We contaminate water in different ways in different places to different degrees around the world. Sometimes it's human wastes, sometimes increasingly it's industrial wastes in different combinations of industrial contaminants, and we don't clean water adequately in many parts of the world. Even where we do clean water, we often don't clean it adequately. And there are new contaminants all the time that are posing challenges for us. So there's a quantity problem and there's a quality problem as well. We use water for everything, especially to grow food. 80% of the water we use as humans goes to grow food, for irrigated agriculture. And so as the population of the world grows, as the economy of the world grows, there are challenges to our ability to meet the demands for goods and services that we want, to grow enough food, to make semiconductors, to do the things we want. And so that's a growing challenge. Needless to say, all of the water humans use comes from the natural environment, the hydrologic cycle, the rivers and the lakes and the streams and the wetlands that also have a value that we don't fully understand or appreciate, but a value. And so part of the environmental problems we face around the world are directly tied to our use of water. The fights we're having, for those of you who are from California, in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, over fish species, over loss of wetlands, is a conflict between human use of water and ecosystem use of water. The problems in the Everglades that we see, the problems on the Colorado River with endangered species are conflicts between human uses of water and the environment. And so that's a fundamental component of the global water crisis as well. We have ecosystem challenges. And a fundamental part of that is the climate. The hydrologic cycle, that is evaporation, the formation of clouds, condensation, precipitation, you all remember this from 5th grade, right? Back to runoff, back to the oceans, back to evaporation. The hydrologic cycle is the climate cycle. And as we change the climate, which we are fundamentally doing, we will fundamentally change water availability and water quality and the timing of storms and so on. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And then finally, water and politics make a volatile mix. Half of the land area of the planet is in what's called an international river basin. Water falls on the ground and in a watershed, it runs off into a river. Half of the land area of the planet is in international river basins where rivers are shared by 2 or more countries. The Colorado River. We think of it as a river in the western US, but it's shared by the US and Mexico. Mississippi River we think of as a completely American river, but there's a tiny part of the Mississippi River watershed that's in Canada. The Nile we think of as a river in Egypt, but there are 9 countries upstream of Egypt that share the Nile Basin watershed. The Rhine, the Danube shared by 18 countries in Europe. The Amazon, we think of as the big river in Brazil, but it's shared by at least 6 countries in South America. So water and politics make up all of these things, and as demands for water grow, as populations grow, as pressures on water resources grow, increasingly we're seeing conflicts, sometimes violent conflicts, over water. So there are threats to national and international security and politics. And there's a whole field, growing field of environmental security addressing that debate. So I'm going to talk about water and the things in red. I'm going to talk specifically about water and food briefly. In a little more detail, I'm going to talk about water and climate change in a little more detail. I could talk about all of these as a separate talk in themselves, but I don't have time, and you don't have time. So let me talk about water and food. This is a graph of rice production in Australia from 1960 all the way on the left to 2009, the last year for which there are data. Now, some of you may know there's been a very severe drought in Australia, multi-year drought, 9-year, 10-year drought, historical drought, unprecedented drought, they say. Now, ironically, this last year there's been some of the worst flooding Australia's ever seen. So we'll talk about climate change in a minute. But during this bad drought, things just, first there were a couple of years of drought and that was bad enough, and then it just kept going on, and things got worse and worse. And the Australians had to do things that they've never had to do before in terms of cutting back water to agriculture, getting rid of lawns, restricting water for industry. They had to progressively take more and more difficult steps to deal with their increasing water shortage. And one of the things that they had to do was they had to cut back water deliveries to certain growers, certain agricultural sectors. Australia used to grow a lot of rice, and you can see the plummeting production of rice in the last few years. It went from basically about 1.6 million tons of rice a year to about 16,000 tons of rice, effectively zero, because they couldn't afford the water to grow rice. So a clear connection, as we all know, between water availability and food production. We have to make choices about what we grow. When you're seriously constrained, you make difficult choices, and for them, one of them was no longer to be a rice producer. Maybe temporarily, as the waters come back, but maybe not. But there's another piece to this puzzle, and that's this. This is world rice prices from 1989 to 2009. And what it shows is an enormous spike in rice prices just when Australia cut back on their production. The reality is world food markets are incredibly delicately balanced right now between supply and demand. And if any one country has a serious problem with production, in this case of rice, it affects global prices because the demand exceeds the supply. And as any economist will tell you, when demand exceeds supply, prices go up. So when Australia's drought led to them stopping rice production, it led to a global spike in rice costs. And rice is a fundamental staple for some of the poorest people on the planet. Now, I'm not going to show this, but let me just mention it. It's an issue related to the connections between water and energy, which I didn't mention in my list. But there are very strong connections between water and energy. It takes a lot of energy to produce our water, to move our water to Southern California, to use water at home for heating hot water. It takes a lot of energy to treat water. It takes a lot of energy to purify water and deliver it. There's a very strong connection there. But it also takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of water to produce energy, for power plant cooling, There are strong connections between energy and water. So a couple of years ago, a policy decision was made to try and reduce our reliance on foreign oil. As you probably know, the U.S. imports a tremendous amount of oil, primarily from the Persian Gulf, primarily from countries that are not necessarily our friends in the long run, or even the short run. And so there's a security issue, and there's forever been a security issue associated with imported oil. So there was an effort to say, all right, let's produce more liquid fuels domestically and reduce our reliance on foreign oil. And the way the U.S. chose to do this was to heavily subsidize ethanol. Ethanol production from corn. Turns out you can use vegetable matter to make energy, to make liquid fuels. You can use corn, or sometimes other things, but in the U.S. primarily corn, to make ethanol, and you can burn ethanol in cars. So we subsidized ethanol. Corn prices went way up. The value of corn went way up. We planted a lot more corn. And one of the implications was global prices for corn went through the roof. And the price of tortillas in Mexico went through the roof because the market became imbalanced. We tried to solve an energy problem without thinking about the interconnections with water availability, with food prices, with all of the connections that are, with all of those different kinds of connections. It's a really good example of the need to think a little more carefully about the interrelationship among all of the things we want to do, energy and water and food and more. So, I don't want to suggest that the drought in Australia, followed by unprecedented flooding, is climate change. We don't know if it's climate change. We do know we're loading the dice. We're loading the climate dice. We are making it more and more likely that we're going to influence extreme events, floods and droughts. We know that humans are fundamentally changing the climate, and that it's going to get worse and worse. So with that in mind, the connections between climate and water are very clear. And some of the implications are, first of all, a hotter world, global warming. It's going to get, and is already getting, warmer. We're going to see changes in precipitation patterns, both the frequency and intensity of rainfall. And in fact, there's evidence already that we are seeing changes in the frequency and intensity of rainfall. How much we get, where we get it, the seasonality of it, and that's going to be a challenge. We're going to see very dynamic and dramatic changes in snowfall and snowmelt. And again, we're seeing this already in California. We're seeing it very clearly in glacial areas, in high latitude areas. The Himalayas are melting fast. The glaciers are disappearing. Permafrost is melting. The Alps, glaciers in the Alps are melting. Glaciers in the Andes are melting. The Sierras are seeing less snowfall and more rain because of global warming. We're going to see a change in the timing of runoff in California, where you get more water earlier and less water later, which is a problem for our water system. So changes in snowfall and snowmelt are going to happen. Sea levels are going to go up and are already going up for two reasons. Warmer water takes up more space than colder water. It's called thermal expansion. And as the oceans warm, which they are, sea level will go up. And as ice that's sitting on land melts, it runs into the oceans, and that increases the volume of the oceans. And that's another contributor to sea level rise. Needless to say, there will be impacts on coasts of every country that has coastal infrastructure. But we're also going to see impacts on water resources. Groundwater that's contaminated by more saltwater intrusion. We're going to see changes in freshwater, saltwater ecosystems, like the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is very sensitive to the amount of fresh water that comes out of the Sacramento-San Joaquin rivers and the amount of salt water that comes in from San Francisco Bay. And where that mix occurs affects the species that can survive in those ecosystems. We'll see changes in extreme events, storm patterns. In California, we get almost all of our water in storms. that come off the Pacific. And in California, a dry year is a year when basically we get 1 or 2 fewer storms off the Pacific than we normally get. Either they don't form or they go further north to Washington and Oregon. A wet year is a year in which we get 1 or 2 more storms off the Pacific, or they hit the Sierras in a certain way. We're very sensitive in California, as much of the rest of the world is sensitive, to storm patterns off the Pacific. And climate change will affect storm frequency and intensity. We may get the same number of storms, but they might be stronger, or they might be weaker. We're loading the dice, the probability of changes of extreme events. We're going to see alterations in water quality. Warmer water causes water quality problems in high altitude lakes and high latitude lakes. It changes stream flow dynamics. We'll see all sorts of changes in water quality as well. So there are very close connections between climate and water. And yet, from an institutional point of view, we're not very good at planning for that. We're not very good as a society at integrating changing climate into the way we manage our water systems. Water managers are trained to assume that future climate's going to look the same as the past climate. That's the way we build our reservoirs. It's the way we build our aqueducts. It's the way we design our systems. It's the way we build our models that operate those systems. But if there's anything that the climate community is telling us, it's that the future's not going to look the same as the past. And that's an institutional challenge. And so there will be effects on water systems that we build as well. Not just the hydrology, but the infrastructure. So the bottom line there is that climate change adds new uncertainties about water risks, about water availability, and water quality. This is a photograph from the year 2000 from the Mississippi Basin when they had a 1 in a 500-year flood event. Hydrologists talk about probabilities of severe events. So a 1 in a 500-year flood event is a flood of a magnitude that the hydrologic record tells us will occur on average once every 500 years. The problem was we had a 1 in a 500-year flood event on the Mississippi River in 1993, 7 years before this. Now, we can have 2 1 in a 500-year flood events 2 years in a row and not have another one for 1,000 years. And the statistics would be okay. But the fact that we did have 2 1 in a 500-year flood events within 7 years of each other makes the hydrologists and the guys who manage the Mississippi Basin very, very nervous. Okay, so let me talk about bottled water. A little change in theme here. But as a symptom of many of the challenges that we face in the water world, in the context of the failure to meet basic human needs for water, and as all of you probably, many of you have no doubt experienced, there are many parts of the world when we travel where we have to drink bottled water, or we're told we have to drink bottled water, because they don't have a safe tap water system, because there has been a failure to meet basic human needs for safe drinking water. Bottled water is a symptom of our convenient society and the lack of public water and how difficult it is to find public drinking fountains anymore. It's a symptom of taste. It's a symptom of marketing and the world that we're surrounded by with advertising pushing us to buy this or that thing. It's a symptom of our fear about water quality. But it also raises questions about equity and access to water, the human right to water, versus the economic value of water. And it also raises questions about environmental choices that we make, the consequences of the choices that we make. And I'm going to touch on a number of these issues. So, Bob mentioned the book. I highly recommend it. So, why do people drink bottled water? Well, one reason is convenience. It's increasingly difficult to find a clean, working water fountain. And it's increasingly easy to find bottled water. Where I work in Oakland at the Pacific Institute, I can buy bottled water closer to my office than I can find a working water fountain. Now, I have tap water in my office, which is what we drink, and we got rid of our bottled water a long time ago. But there's no public water fountain closer than there is bottled water. In fact, the truth is I could probably buy bottled water at half a dozen places near my office before I could find a working water fountain. So convenience is a challenge. And I have to tell you a funny story. The University of Central Florida, for years, didn't have a football stadium. Football is a big deal at the University of Central Florida. Like basketball is a big deal here. I couldn't resist, but that news even got to Northern California. Okay, so the university built a football stadium. They were hugely proud of this. They spent, I don't know, $40 or $50 million. They built a 50,000 seat football stadium. Opening day was September 17th, I think, 2007. It was built with 45,000 seats and no water fountains. No water fountains in a football stadium. Opening day, September, the stands were packed. It was hot, and by halftime, the concessions had run out of bottled water, and 78 people were treated for heat stroke or dehydration. It was big news. It was front page news in that part of the world. And it's an example of bad planning. It's an example of the belief that we can just sell bottled water. We don't have to provide public water. I mean, it's just the concept that you could build a football stadium without water fountains is outrageous. Now, interestingly, the week this happened, the day after this happened, in a remarkable example of social movements, some students at the University of Central Florida started a Facebook page called Knights for Water, K-N-I-G-H-T-S. Knights is the logo, the motto of the University of Central Florida. And within a couple of days, they had hundreds and hundreds of friends at that point, fans, on this page, and it pushed the University of Central Florida to install 40 water fountains in the stadium. At first, the university said, oh, we could have had 1 million fountains and it wouldn't have prevented the problem. They backed off of that line pretty quickly, and they decided that they would install water fountains in the stadium. But again, it's an example of this tension between public availability of water and commercial availability of water. Marketing. So another reason we buy bottled water is because we're told it's going to be from a pristine mountainous place, or it's going to be like a fine wine. You see the corkscrew at the top there? A fine wine. Or if you drink my bottled water, you too can look like Jennifer Aniston. Not me, maybe, but you, maybe. And women, correct me in the audience, but I think this is an ad for women, not for men, actually. Or fear. For those of you who don't read French, this says, I don't drink the water that I use. That's the toilet on the left. And on the right, my choice is crystalline. It's a bottled water sold extensively in France. This ad was very heavily pushed in Paris, and it caused the city of Paris to fight back. And they launched a public ad campaign against bottled water, which was very interesting, which is the stories in the book. Or drink my bottled water and you'll be loved, or you'll be strong, or you'll be healthy. This is a bottled water brand that claims their bottled water will make you these things. It'll make you healthier, or more loved, or happy, or strong. And of course, the other marketing tool is sex. So many things are sold in this country on the basis of sex. I will note, this particular brand of bottled water is the most expensive bottled water you can find. It's $50 a bottle. And you don't get the woman, I'm sorry. Anyway. It's got Swarovski crystals on the bottle. Anyway, it's ridiculous. But it's an example of the marketing that we're bombarded with all the time. And then there's this. This is a flyer that I got in my mailbox. And it says, there's something in the glass you don't want to drink, and it's not the fish. And that's the fear argument again. It's the idea that there's something you can't see in your tap water, but that you ought to be afraid of. And this was a flyer for a bottled water company that wanted to deliver bottled water to my home. And they wanted to do it by making me fear my tap water. I live in Berkeley, California. The tap water in Berkeley, California is unbelievably good. It comes from the McCallum River, comes through a sealed aqueduct that's pristine Sierra Nevada water, like much of the water in California. But anyway, you get the idea. So the result of this, convenience, taste, fear, marketing, is that bottled water sales in the United States have exploded. In the 1970s, we drank maybe a gallon of water per person. That's down here. It was about a gallon of water per person in 1976, and almost all of that was the big 6-gallon containers in offices. There wasn't the individual little serving of bottled water that we see everywhere now. And by 2008, 2007, it was 30 gallons per person per year. A huge exponential increase in the sales of bottled water. It's working. Now, is our tap water as safe as it needs to be? No. I'd be the first to acknowledge that our tap water could be safer than it is. I would also argue, though, is our bottled water as safe as we think it is, or as safe as the bottled water companies would like to make us think it is? And I'd like to say the answer to that is no, as well. So, we used to have water-related diseases in the United States. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, guinea worm, not schistosomiasis, those are more tropical diseases, but cholera especially, typhoid especially, was rampant. In the 1850s, waves of cholera swept around the world and millions of people died from cholera because we didn't understand that cholera came with contaminated water. In the 1850s, there was a big debate about whether it came from the air. Well, we didn't really know. But as the Industrial Revolution proceeded, as the scientific revolution proceeded, as we learned more and more about these things, we learned that water-related diseases, we learned that these diseases were water-related. And in the United States, in 1909, we introduced chlorination. In Jersey City, New Jersey. It was the first city to chlorinate its water. And filtration and different methods for filtering and treating tap water, for purifying water. And when we did that, cholera and typhoid disappeared. When we put in place a high-quality tap water system around the country, water-related diseases disappeared. And today, we have a tap water system that most of the rest of the world wishes it had. It's superb. It's not perfect, and there are problems with it. And when there are problems, we hear about it, because the federal laws require that when there are problems, the public's notified that day. The laws are very strict about tap water quality. But those laws are old. They need to be brought into the 21st century. There are new contaminants. There's inadequate federal protections. There's weak monitoring sometimes. There's weak enforcement. There are challenges with our tap water system, but those challenges can be easily fixed at a far lower cost than moving to bottled water. So my first argument is fix our tap water system. We know how to do that. Let's do it better. But let's not assume that our bottled water is any better. And in the course of research for this book, I ended up having to file a series of Freedom of Information Act requests with the federal government to get information about bottled water recalls. There are bottled water recalls. Well, actually, let me back up for a minute. The US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, regulates tap water under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Bottled water is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration as a food product because it's sold in little packages, individual packages. They consider it a food product. But it is regulated, mostly the water quality regulations for bottled water and tap water are the same. They're not identical. I think they're weaker for bottled water in a number of important cases, a number of important areas. And they're definitely less well regulated and enforced. The monitoring for tap water is daily for big cities, often dozens of times a day. Bottled water, not at all. Monthly, the standards vary, but it's not as frequent. But there are bottled water problems. We just tend not to hear about them because they aren't required to be reported to the public. So I filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests, and I ended up getting hundreds of cases of bottled water recalls for contamination with benzene and E. coli and all sorts of processing chemicals and mold and glass particles and sanitizer. I mean, it was quite a mix. But my favorite was a case in 1993 when a water bottler in Texas issued a recall because their bottled water was contaminated with crickets. These are crickets. I would note that recall occurred 3 months after the bottles hit the market. So whether any of those bottles were actually recalled, we'll never know. All right. Because the FDA regulates bottled water, the FDA requires that the standard label be put on bottled water. That's put on all food products. So this is a bottled water label, a nutrition label, and it tells us that there are no calories, and there's no fat, and there's no cholesterol, and there's no carbohydrates, and there's no protein, and there are no vitamins. Great. We probably knew that, because those things aren't in water. But there are lots of things in water. Water is the universal solvent. It dissolves everything. Water found in nature naturally contains minerals. Lots of minerals, and it depends on where it is. Water that falls out of the sky contains minerals. But we don't hear about it in the labels that we get. Now, European bottled water label requirements are quite different. They're required to give you the mineral components of bottled water, of mineral waters. And they can include all of these components. These aren't contaminants. These are natural minerals. Like anything, if you reach a level that's too high, it's considered a contaminant. Sodium. There's naturally occurring salts in all water. If it gets too salty, it doesn't taste very good. So there are standards for the levels of these minerals in different kinds of water. But there are mineral waters with incredibly diverse constituents in Europe. In fact, it used to be that mineral waters in Europe were famous for their different makeups. People would buy different bottled waters for the different mineral components. But we don't require these same standards, this same information. We don't require water quality information on the labels. We don't require a phone number or a website where people can go for all the information. We don't require information about how the water was processed. We don't require information about where the water comes from on our bottled water labels. Okay, but here's another fun thing. Bottled water companies are allowed to say almost anything in terms of branding. So there is an Arctic Springs bottled water. There is an Arctic Falls bottled water. There's a Glacial Mountain bottled water. There's a Yosemite bottled water. There's an Everest bottled water. And where do they come from? Arctic Springs comes from Florida. Arctic Falls comes from Oklahoma. And the Arctic's in enough trouble as it is, but I know it doesn't extend down as far as Florida or Oklahoma. Glacial Mountain comes from Ohio, and the last time there were glaciers in Ohio was about 10,000 years ago. Yosemite water used to come from LA. I think actually it's in the midst of either bankruptcy or a transition. Everest water comes from Texas, and as I say in the book, there are a lot of big things in Texas, but Mount Everest isn't one of them. So bottled water companies don't put lots of things on their label, but there are other things that they put on their label that probably ought not to be on the label. You've all probably seen this. This is a company that runs a vending machine. They're outside almost every big grocery store, especially in big cities, where people can come and fill up their own containers with filtered tap water. Now, tap water meets federal standards already, but this is very expensive water compared to tap water. And it's really basically filtered tap water. There's also an economic price and cost to bottled water, and prices and costs aren't always the same thing. Bottled water literally costs thousands of times more than tap water. Providing safe water for everyone could be done at a fraction of the cost of what we collectively spend on bottled water every year. The amount of money required to meet basic human needs for water for everyone on the planet is less than the amount of money the planet spends on bottled water. And there are other costs that we don't see in the prices of anything we pay. Environmental costs, social costs, and political costs. So let me talk briefly about some of the environmental costs associated with bottled water. Bottled water, most of the bottled water that's sold today in individual servings comes from polyethylene terephthalate, PET. It's the #1 plastic in the little triangles where we identify the different kinds of plastics that we use. This is actually what a plastic bottle looks like before it's blown into the plastic. So that's a pre-bottle, if you will. It's called a pre-form. And they make these, and then at bottling water plants, they turn these into the bottle shapes, and then they fill them with water. PET is a great plastic. It's great. It's transparent. It's cheap. It's unbreakable. It doesn't impart a taste to the food. It doesn't leach bad things, as far as we know, into the water or into the food. It's 100% recyclable, which is different than recycled, but it's recyclable. It's a really great plastic, and that's one of the reasons why beverage companies use it for beverages. But it's not without its costs. There's a huge energy requirement to make plastic bottles. This stuff comes from fossil fuels, mostly petroleum and natural gas and electricity. It takes about 1/3 of the volume of a plastic bottle worth of petroleum to make the plastic bottle. So every time you buy a bottle of water or buy a bottle of Coke or something, imagine it 1/4 to 1/3 filled with oil. That's the amount of energy required to make the plastic bottle. And it takes more to move it to where you use it from where we produce it. So there's a serious energy and, by implications, environmental and by implications, climate cost to our choices. The other thing is, we make a lot of these bottles and then they end up like this. We don't recycle them. They're recyclable, but they're not recycled. And the bottled water industry loves to say, and you'll see it in their ads, these bottles are 100% recyclable. And that's true, but they're not recycled. In fact, only about 25 or 30% of the plastic bottles we use ever are recycled. And they're really what we call downcycled. They're not made back into bottles, they're made into something less valuable, carpet or strapping material, or the fiber fill in coats, or clothing, things like that. Some parts of the world do a better job recycling than we do. This is a photograph from China. So, for the last part of this, let me come back to the global story and talk about solutions. There are solutions to our water problems. There are many solutions to our water problems. And in fact, I'd like to argue that we're moving toward what I call a soft path for water, a sustainable future for water. And there are a lot of components to this. And I'm just going to talk briefly about some of them. One is we have to develop new supplies of water. But we have to rethink what we mean by supply. And we have to do it to different standards. So in the United States and in California, I would argue we're not going to build any more big dams. Maybe a couple more. But they come at an increasing environmental and social and political cost, and it's hard. We've built on all the good dam sites, and some not so good dam sites. But that doesn't mean there aren't new sources of supply out there. There's rainwater harvesting. There's smart conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater. The smartest new reservoir in California is using groundwater in ways where we fill groundwater that we've overpumped during wet years, refill it during wet years, and then pump it out during dry years. That's conjunctive use. And more water basins in California are exploring smart surface water and groundwater joint management. That's a new potential source of supply. There's desalination, if we're willing to pay the economic cost and the energy cost of desalination. There's treated wastewater. We collect wastewater, we treat it often to a very high standard, and then in the past, we've thrown it away. It's time to think about wastewater as a source of supply for lawns, for flushing toilets, for things that don't perhaps require potable uses of water. And increasingly in California, and California is leading the way in many ways in this area, we're reusing more and more wastewater. It's an asset. It's a new source of supply, not a liability. There are parts of the world where we need new infrastructure, traditional dams and aqueducts and water treatment plants. But we should build them to a higher standard. We should bring communities into the decision about how and where we build them. We should think about ecosystems when we build them, which we've never thought about in the past. So let's rethink supply. Let's expand and improve our water infrastructure. We have an incredible infrastructure in the United States, but it needs to be expanded and it needs to be maintained better than we're maintaining it. And it gets back to this argument about tap water. We can improve the quality of our tap water. There are places where water doesn't taste very good in the United States. It may be perfectly safe to drink, but people don't like to drink it because they don't like the way it tastes. And there are places where I think there are contaminants in our water which we'd like to get out of our water. We know how to do those things. We can take anything we want out of water. We can make seawater perfectly potable. We can take anything we want out of water. We can make water taste like anything and, with existing technology. And it may mean that some of us are going to pay a little more in our bills, but far less than we would pay if we were to abandon our tap water system and go to bottled water. We don't want to do that. But in addition to rethinking supply, I think we need to rethink demand. In fact, this is a key element of the soft path to water. Let's rethink what we're doing with our water. We use water for a lot of different things, for growing food, for making semiconductors, for washing our clothes, for drinking, for whatever. Think about anything, and it pretty much requires water. But I'd like to argue that we can do the things we want with less water than we're doing now. We can grow more food with less water. We can wash our clothes with less water. We can make semiconductors with less water. Let's improve the efficiency with which we use water. And the good news is we're doing that. Efficiency of our water use is going up all over the country. It's a great thing. I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's create and enforce stricter standards for water quality. I've touched on this already. Let's use proper pricing in markets. I believe very strongly water is a human right. I wrote about this more than a decade ago. Last year, after 20 years of debate about this, if not more, the United Nations Human Rights Council passed a binding resolution declaring a human right to water. It was a remarkable success. But water is also an economic good. You and I ought to pay for our water services. Maybe water's free, but we're paying for the high quality of treatment and we're paying for the wastewater removal, and water's also an economic good. Let's pay the proper price for water, because when water's priced properly, we'll use it more efficiently. We'll allocate it more efficiently. So we have to balance human right for water, the economic value of water, and equity issues. And we're not good at that. Let's improve and expand public participation about water. All too often, decisions about water in the past were made by mostly engineers. Water is more than an engineering issue. It's a community issue. And some of the most successful water projects in the developing world are community-based water projects. Let's fix our water institutions. We manage water in a lot of different ways, at the local level, up to the federal level, to the international level where water crosses borders. There are a lot of different water institutions. I'm the last one to argue that there's any one place where we ought to manage water. We have to manage it at the right place, but we ought to manage it better. We're not doing a very good job at all of those levels. So there is a real water crisis in a lot of different forms, in a lot of different places. We're never going to run out of water. I don't want to suggest that, although there are places where we're increasingly running into limits, what I call peak water limits, on both a renewable basis, where we're using the entire renewable flow, like the Colorado River. That's a peak water limit. We might want to use more water out of the Colorado, but once you're using it all, that's a constraint. And we're seeing that in more and more rivers around the world. We're also past the point of peak non-renewable water. There are many places in the world where we're over-pumping groundwater, just like, and we're consuming it, like we over-pump oil. And groundwater levels are dropping, and that's not sustainable. So we're increasingly running into constraints about the amount of water we can use and when we can use it. Excessive use of water or inadequate supply or contamination is already affecting industrial production, agricultural production, and human health. There are real consequences to our water problems. In northern China, which is the water-short part of China, the western U.S. is the water-short part of the U.S., the eastern part's a little more water-rich. In China, the north is water-poor and the south is relatively water-rich. In northern China, they're already placing constraints on the kinds of industry that they're permitting to be built. And they're not allowing water-intensive industries to move into northern China. They're saying they have to move into southern China, where there may be more water availability. So we're already seeing constraints on the industrial side. You saw the graphs about rice production in Australia. There are serious wheat failures in northern China this year. That's one of the reasons why the price of wheat at the world level is going up. We're seeing the cost of food fundamentally being affected by water availability. There are enormous opportunities for all of the soft path solutions that I've mentioned. But it's going to require new thinking and new approaches. At the Pacific Institute, we've done studies on the potential for urban water use efficiency and agricultural water use efficiency, focused on California. And the answer is, we've made enormous progress at improving our efficiency of water use in California, in the urban and the agricultural sector. But there's still enormous untapped potential. So, how many of you have a top-loading washing machine?
All the doors.
Okay, lots of you. How many of you have a front-loading washing machine? All right, it's about half and half now. So front-loading washing machines use much less water, much less energy, much less detergent. And I would argue they clean your clothes better, but that's subjective. These other things are measurable. That's a good example. It's a simple technology. Eventually, you're all going to have either front-loading washing machines or some of the new efficient top-loading washing machines. They're never quite as efficient. But it's a good example. We've made some progress, but there's more progress to be made. And they pay for themselves long before their lifetime is up. They're cost-effective. They might cost a little more up front, but the savings in water and energy and detergent pays for that additional upfront cost. It used to take 6 gallons to flush a toilet in the United States. That was the standard before 1980, at which point California put in place a 3.5 gallon per flush standard. And then in 1992, the federal standard went to 1.6 gallons per flush. There's a new California standard of 1.2 gallons per flush to be phased in over time. That's a huge improvement in water use efficiency for flushing toilets. Moving from flood irrigation to drip irrigation saves a huge amount of water. Sometimes that water is reapplied right on that same field by the farmer to grow more food, or it's used on a field next door. So it may not be transferable. It is transferable. You may not transfer it to a different user, but it's an improvement in agricultural production. We get more food per unit water. Those are enormous advantages, and the potential to do more is still enormous. Truly sustainable water management and use is going to require improved efficiency, smarter economics, advanced technology, or better application of existing technology, and better governance and management. And let me show you perhaps the one thing that I want you to remember, which is, in my mind, part of the good news of what's going on here. This is a graph that shows the gross national product of the United States from 1900 to 2005. And it shows what every economist loves to see, exponential growth in our economy. And I'm not going to get into a debate about whether or not that's a good thing or not, but that's the reality. We like to see exponential growth in our economy. I could show population too, and our population would also be growing exponentially. The assumption in the water world has always been that as our population, as our economy grows exponentially, so will our demand for water. And up until the late 70s and the early 80s, that was true. Our demand for water actually very nicely paralleled this exponential growth in our economy. But then in 1980, something happened. Now, a lot of something's happened, which I can touch on. And today, in the United States, we use less water for everything than we used in 1980. Our demand for water has actually gone down from a peak. We use less water for everything, for growing food, for cooling power plants, for flushing our toilets, for washing our clothes, for making semiconductors, everything, than we used in 1980. So on a per capita basis, because populations continue to grow, which is water use per person, it's gone way down. We use a lot less water per person than we used in 1980. This is great news. We've broken the connection. Now, if we hadn't, it would have continued up like this. And I don't know where we would have found this much water, this additional increment of water. I mean, the reality is that's more than the entire country's using today. We would have had to double our demand for water from rivers and lakes and groundwater. I don't think we could have done it. I think there would have been literally a physical constraint on that. But more than that is at play. So there are lots of reasons. There are a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And I'm going to just describe a couple of them briefly. And I don't mean to suggest that I've actually quantified each of these. So this isn't a quantitative argument, but we've changed agricultural water production. We're more efficient. So we're growing more food on the same amount of land. And that's permitted us to stop increasing withdrawals of water for agriculture. But it's permitted us to grow more food and feed a growing population. That's part of it. Our urban efficiency and our industrial efficiency is improving. We're using front-loading washing machines and low-flow toilets, and we're using 6 gallons of water to make a square inch of semiconductors now instead of 30. We're using 3 to 5 tons of water to make a ton of steel instead of 200, which is what we used to use. So part of that is our economy has continued to grow, but it hasn't required more water. Part of it is a mix of industrial activities. We're doing fewer water-intensive things in the United States now than we used to. More of our water-intensive industries have moved overseas, and that's part of it. And that's not efficiency, that's a change in the structure of our economy. We're using wastewater for certain things. We're exploring new water supply opportunities. All of the pieces of the soft path, I think, are evident in this split, and figuring out actually what's responsible for what would be a great thesis for somebody. What about bottled water? Bottled water is not going to disappear. And I don't argue in my book that we ban bottled water. It's a commodity. That's the reality of our commercial capitalist society. It's a commodity. But I think we could tackle the reasons people buy bottled water, and I think we could end up buying a lot less of it than we do. The production of bottled water and the consumption of bottled water has serious costs, environmental costs, economic costs, and social costs that I've addressed. We have to tackle those problems directly and tackle the reasons people buy bottled water. Restore trust in tap water. People are going to buy less bottled water. Deal with the taste problems when people don't like the taste of their water. People are going to buy less bottled water. Rein in unscrupulous marketing of bottled water, something the FDA and the Federal Trade Commission have not done. And people will be fooled less often. Deal with the convenience factor. Put water fountains back into our public spaces. And people would buy less bottled water. So, let's support and expand state-of-the-art tap water systems. Let's develop, pass, and enforce smarter water regulations. Let's bring our water laws into the 21st century. They were great in the 20th century. They ought to be better. Let's put public water back in public spaces. Let's protect consumers from fraud and misrepresentations. Let's require truthful labeling on our bottled water. And let's reduce bottled water's environmental impact. Bottled water is a symptom of a bigger problem. But I truly believe we can move to a sustainable future for water. And it's beginning to happen. Finally, I just note, you probably noticed this on the graph when I showed it the first time, but this incredible increase in bottled water sales, that exponential increase we're seeing everywhere, in 2008 and 2009, for the first time, bottled water sales tipped down. Now, I've had long conversations with the bottled water industry, as you might imagine, and they argue this is due to the economy. And that's partly true, I'm sure. But I also believe that there's a backlash going on. I think more and more people are aware of the problems with bottled water. There's more education about it, there's more information about it. There's at least one good book written about bottled water. There are campaigns to remove bottled water from universities, including some efforts here. Restaurants have started, some restaurants have started not selling bottled water, including a number in California that have led the way. Some municipalities are beginning to say, look, we can't afford to buy bottled water for our municipal meetings. And besides, we have great municipal tap water. There are a number of aspects of this that I think have contributed to that. And we'll see where it goes from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. So we have a little bit of time to have a dialogue. Put down your bottle of water and Paul, you want to start?
Thank you, Peter, for your interesting talk as always. Do you have any information on what the total quantity of bottled water is actually treated municipal water and how they get their municipal water?
Yes, that's a great point. I probably should have said. So, bottled water in the U.S. comes from two sources. It comes from municipal tap water, almost always treated again, filtered, goes through other processes before it's bottled. Or it comes from what we call springs. And if it says spring water on it, this is one thing where labeling has to be reasonably accurate. If your bottled water actually says spring water on it, it's supposed to come from a spring, or really from a groundwater well drilled into a spring. So Nestle's, which is the biggest bottled water seller in the United States, primarily sells spring water. Arrowhead is spring water, and it's Nestle's. Deer Park on the East Coast, Poland Spring is Nestle's. Those are all Nestle's. Zephyr Hills in Florida, almost all the big brands turn out to be owned by Nestle's, the spring water brands. That's about 55%. Spring water is about 55% of the bottled water sold in the U.S. But the other 45%, and increasingly large fraction, is municipal tap water. Dasani, which is Coke, Aquafina, which is Pepsi, Nestle Pure Life, which is their municipal brand, are the three dominant ones. Those are all reprocessed tap water. And I visited, I went to all these different bottling plants when I was writing my book. And I went to the Arrowhead plant down at Cabazon in Southern California desert, taking water from the desert. And I went up to a Coke plant where they're bottling Coke and Diet Coke and Zero, and one of their lines is devoted to Dasani. And it's just processed, reprocessed, high-quality East Bay municipal tap water.
I'm from San Francisco, and I don't know a lot about the American water system, but I know that San Francisco's water comes from Hetch Hetchy, and I know it's some of the best, cleanest, and best tasting water in the world.
Yep.
But in the past, I don't know, I'm 20 years old, and there seems to have been this new cultural thing about the taste of water. And you talk briefly every now and then during your speech about the taste of water. And it seems to be that it's not okay anymore for water to taste differently, no matter where you go. And one thing I hear a lot in the Bay Area is that the water in Southern California, it tastes terrible. And now that I've been here for 2 years, I've tasted public water all over Los Angeles, and I've never been to a water fountain and tasted it and been like, oh my God, that's awful. And so I guess my question is, where do you think that this cultural change has occurred? Is it bottled water marketing? Is it just that? I was hoping maybe you could speak about that.
So taste is a very personal thing. There are places where tap water doesn't taste good to me. It might taste good to the people who were there. I grew up in New York City, which has unbelievably great tap water also. But it tastes different than the tap water in the Bay Area, and it tastes different than the tap water in Southern California. And the water in Los Angeles tastes different than the water in the valley. I mean, water tastes differently based on its mineral composition, and tastes are very personal. I understand it when people tell me their water doesn't taste good and they want to buy a filter, which might improve the water taste. And I'm not a big fan of water filters, but if people really don't like the taste of their water and they think it's better with the filters, then that's a personal choice. I would also note, though, that there's a remarkable amount of experience of blind taste tests where people are asked to taste tap water, different bottled water brands, without knowing what they're tasting. And I participated personally in easily a dozen blind taste tests for water. And when I'm being honest, I really usually can't tell the difference, almost anywhere. And people usually can't tell the difference. And when they do these blind taste tests, often the results are random. It's like a random, it's like you get the same result if people were randomly guessing, which in a sense they are. Now sometimes that's not true, but it's often true. Often they like the cheaper bottled water rather than the more expensive bottled water. I mean, it's really taste is a funny thing. But I do believe we could produce good tasting water in places where water doesn't taste good because of high mineral content, because of bad pipes. It varies. I think the Bay Area has great tasting tap water.
To segue with that word pipes, this is more the other end of water when you have to urinate. The water urinals are a great way to save water, but we have a plumber here who absolutely hates them because he's seen the results of crystallization of urine in the piping and plumbing issues.
You're talking about the waterless urinal.
Correct. And then also with the lower flush toilets, we've had trouble on campus because some of our pipe inclines are to the point where we're not flushing enough water through to get the solids through, and it's creating large blockage issues. And so we've kind of shifted towards the dual option toilets so that you can have a number 2 flush and number 1 flush. Sorry to get so practical, but I'm facilities based, so.
This is my world.
Okay, great. So
I've heard it all.
I would love to hear some of your practical plumber perspectives on dealing with the waste side of water.
I've heard all of those arguments too. Almost always they're wrong. But I don't know if they're wrong here. I've never actually seen a place where the inclines were a problem for low-flow toilets. But it's plausible. I've never really heard effective complaints about the waterless urinals. In general, the facilities that have put them in love them. But it's possible. And they're different models and they're different the different approaches to the waterless urinary. It's also true that when we first changed the standard to low-flow toilets, what the manufacturers did was they simply cut the flow. They didn't redesign the toilets, and a lot of them were bad and didn't do the job, without going into any more detail. But that era is over, and the new toilets are incredibly great. I have a 1.1 gallon per flush toilet in my home, and it's the best toilet I've ever had. It's never had a problem. There is now an official test standard where they rate toilets, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of models of toilets for their effectiveness and their efficiency. And it's called the MAP test, NAP, and it just rates every toilet. And just, I would argue, buy good ones. You can get the best quality toilet at no more expensive cost than some of the badly designed ones. So I understand the facility arguments. I think you have to be careful about them and do the right thing in the right place. You don't want to cause problems for plumbing, but in general, the efficient appliances don't cause any problems.
I met a farmer in Louisiana a couple months ago who was running his own self-contained organic farm using tilapia fisheries and using kind of green filtration. And he was talking about how he was actually selling this green water at farmers markets, as well as letting it kind of a natural flow into his crops, and that this green water had more nutrients, so he obviously didn't require him using any other inputs. And I was wondering if you could speak to the kind of the soundness of that, and also any feasibility for any infrastructural use of green water in California Central Coast.
I don't know. I'm not sure what he's selling. It could be something brilliant. It could be something totally ridiculous. Honestly, I don't know.
But like green water, is that sort of an accepted concept that using kind of waste from animals? But I mean, this isn't potable water, but that there's kind of a nutrient base. I just don't know.
It's very unlikely to be potable water. Now, the process of growing food or aquaculture,
Yeah.
fish, often leads to nutrients in our water, excessive nutrients. The biggest problem, water quality problem this country has is from non-point sources. We sort of fixed mostly the big industrial polluters, the single point sources where we could identify them, but we haven't dealt with, for example, runoff from agricultural fields. And the huge nitrates and phosphate contamination in the Mississippi Basin and the Gulf of Mexico comes from the agriculture in the millions of acres upstream where we grow soybeans and corn and everything. So excessive nutrients is a problem. But some nutrients in water can be a good thing as well. So it's a question of balance. It's sort of like the idea of any of these minerals in water. Some is good and a lot is often bad. We have to be careful about that. So in his case, I'd have to look at the specifics.
So on campus, we have water fountains, just tap water, but we just started this new program in the library where we have the little water dispensers with the big tubs. And supposedly that water is coming from groundwater below Oxy, and the Sparklets who supplies it is down the street. As far as the environmental impact goes, and from what I've told you now, do you think that there's more of an environmental impact from water coming through the tap sources to LA, because a lot of water comes from Northern California to LA, or do you think it's better for the school to utilize Arrowhead, who gets the water from below us? I don't know if I said that.
Okay, so I'm not sure, because you're not, I bet, getting water directly from groundwater.
That's just what I've been told.
There's a fault under York Boulevard, and groundwater percolates along it. So the first ever Sparklets bottler is right there.
So there's a bottler there who's bottling.
And right underground.
Okay. Okay, so that's Springer. That's the classic definition of spring water. It has to meet certain standards, they have to test it, they can label it as spring water. Is the water quality better than the water you're getting from the city system? Probably not. The city system is required to meet federal safe drinking water standards. It may taste different. I'm sure it tastes different. There's probably more salts in the Southern California tap water than the Sparkletts water. Maybe not. But it's probably perfectly healthy. So that's is one better than the other? I don't know, but I'll tell you that Sparkletts water is going to be a lot more expensive. Hugely more expensive. That would be my guess, anyway. The university might tell me differently.
How did bottled water initially become such a booming industry?
Okay, so there's a long history of mineral waters, especially in Europe, but in the U.S. in the early part of the, really late 1800s, early 1900s. There were a lot of different mineral waters. Poland Spring, which is now Nestle brand bottled water, was a famous spring in Maine. And people used to go there in the summer, and it was like a resort, and drink the waters. It won best tasting water in the world in the Chicago World's Fair in 1904 or something like that. I mean, so there's been a history of mineral waters for a long time. Ironically enough, Poland Spring water, none of Poland Spring water actually comes from the original Poland Spring anymore. It's still called Poland Spring water, but Nestle's long ago moved away from the original spring. That's another story that's in the book. But I think the exponential growth was the result of a confluence of factors. One of the most important was the invention of cheap plastic. You had to sell bottled water in glass. It would be really expensive. It's heavy to move. You couldn't move it very far because of the energy cost. I think cheap plastic was a big factor. Marketing was a huge factor. Combined with a growing concern about our tap water. Because of, whenever we have a problem with our tap water system, it's in the newspaper, we hear about it. And there are problems with old pipes, old infrastructure, old treatment systems. I think all of those things have played a role in pushing that exponential growth forward. But I think every one of them is addressable. You can fix every one of them.
Let's have one last question.
You kind of touched upon it at the very end about piped water having problems like potentially lead or arsenic or things that you hear about that could get into our tap water, even though it's tested and it's great when it's tested, but when it comes into our house through our faucet, is there a place you would recommend where you can test our water to make sure, or is the lead or other things not that big that we should worry? Because that's my worry. If I'm in an old house, should I drink the water coming out of those pipes?
That's a great question. We test the water at the treatment plant, and then it goes into an old infrastructure system or a new infrastructure. It goes into a set of distribution systems. Now, often the big water agencies also do field tests. So a good example is New York City. I have a picture of it on my phone. New York City's water comes from the Adirondacks, comes from upstate New York. It's a beautifully protected watershed, comes through long aqueducts and pipelines into the city. New York City has hundreds of testing points in the city that they also test regularly to make sure that at the end of the pipes it's clean. But then there's the question about your home. And the biggest concern there is old homes with lead fixtures of some kind. The pipes aren't lead, but often there's lead in the faucet, there's sometimes lead in the connections, and we often hear about lead contamination in older homes. The new faucets don't have lead or have minimal lead. New piping doesn't have lead. I mean, when you replace that stuff, it solves some of those problems. That gets to my point earlier about let's fix our infrastructure. When we have lead contamination problems, it's not because we're putting water with lead in them at the top of the pipe. It's because they're old homes that need to be addressed. And that's a problem. There are tests that can be done, especially for things like lead. It depends on how much money you're willing to spend. I mean, you could get a water test for anything. But you don't need to worry about almost anything. Most things you don't need to worry about. Things like lead, where the pipes might introduce a problem. If you have reason to believe you have old pipes You know, lead tests are cheap. You could probably test. When my kids were in preschool, many years ago, the parents were worried about lead. And since I knew something about water, I went and I arranged to have a lead test done. And there are standards for doing it, and we sent out the water for testing, and it came back and there was no lead problem. There wasn't a problem. And just doing the test and getting the results totally removed that worry from everybody's mind. It was an unknown, and they got an answer. So there are things that can be done.
And do you recommend using those carbon filters or reverse osmosis if you have? I mean,
In
it
general,
sounds like,
no, I don't. Unless you have a reason to be worried. The filters, first of all, they only remove a certain number of things. Mostly, they're good at removing things that aren't in our water. They can remove lead. They can remove chlorine, if you don't like the chlorine taste in your water. I would note, if you have a chlorine taste in your water, put a pitcher of water in the refrigerator. The chlorine evaporates off in a couple of hours. So that's a cheaper way of dealing with it. It can remove things. I'm agnostic about filters because it depends on where you are. It depends on how much money you're willing to spend. You have to replace those filters, or sometimes they can add contaminants to your water over time. So,
Well, on an agnostic note, we went through a lot of different issues, and I really want to thank Peter for sharing his wide expanse of knowledge on water, climate change, bottling water, many of the things that are